Les Paul built the electric guitar. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, he literally built it. He machined the parts, soldered the pickups, shaped the body. He spent years in a chicken coop behind his house in New Jersey, figuring out how to turn wood and wire into something that could hold a note forever. When Gibson finally put his name on the instrument in 1952, it wasn't just a guitar. It was proof that one man's obsession could change what music sounded like. By 1967, Les Paul was 52 years old and had opinions about a lot of things. He had opinions about recording techniques, about tone, about the way musicians approached the instrument he'd helped create. He was not shy about sharing those opinions. And one of his most persistent opinions was about noise. It was a cold Tuesday evening in November 1967. The gathering was at a recording studio on West 44th Street in Manhattan. Not a party exactly. More like a room full of people who all knew each other well enough to be honest and badly enough to be dangerous. A few producers, a couple of session musicians, some label people who smiled at everyone and meant it for none of them. The kind of room where reputations were quietly measured and rarely defended out loud. Les Paul was there because he knew everyone. That was always why Les Paul was somewhere. He stood near the back wall holding a glass of water. He rarely drank at these things, watching the room with the particular attention of someone who had been watching rooms like this for 30 years. He had the look of a man who had already decided what the evening would hold and was mostly waiting to be proven right. Jimi Hendrix arrived late. He came in quietly, the way he always moved through spaces that weren't a stage. He wasn't performing that night. He was there because someone had called and he hadn't had a reason to say no. He wore a purple velvet jacket over a white shirt, carried nothing, and said almost nothing to anyone for the first 20 minutes. He stood near the window on the far side of the room and watched the street below. Les Paul noticed him the way everyone noticed Jimmy in those days. You couldn't not. But noticing wasn't the same as being impressed. Earlier that year, Les Paul had been at a show. He hadn't stayed long. He'd watched Jimmy burn through a set at a small venue downtown. Feedback screaming. The Stratocaster producing frequencies that seemed to go somewhere past music into something else entirely. The crowd had been beside themselves. People who looked like they'd never heard anything, and maybe they hadn't. Les Paul had stood at the back with his arms crossed and felt something he didn't immediately recognize as discomfort. Later at dinner with a few musician friends, he'd said it wasn't guitar playing, that it was theater. He said the electric guitar was built to be played, not to be punished. That feedback was a mistake, a flaw in the signal chain, not a creative choice. He'd spent decades trying to eliminate that sound, building cleaner circuits and better shielding, and now here was this kid treating the flaw like it was the whole instrument. The friends had nodded. Some of them agreed. Some of them weren't sure. Nobody pushed back because Les Paul was Les Paul, and in a room full of musicians that still meant something. What he didn't say, what he didn't have language for yet, was that watching Jimmy had left him unsettled in a way he couldn't fully account for. He filed it away. He was good at filing things away. At the studio that evening, someone had left a guitar in the corner of the room. It was a Les Paul Standard. 1959, sunburst finish, worn at the body edges where years of playing had taken the color down to bare wood. One of the originals. Someone had brought it in earlier for a session and left it propped against the wall like it was nothing. Jimmy noticed it when he turned from the window. He walked over and picked it up the way you pick something up that belongs to someone else, carefully, with a kind of respect that didn't announce itself. Les Paul watched him from across the room. "That's not what I built it for," he said. Not loud, but loud enough. A few heads turned. Someone stopped mid-sentence. Jimmy looked up. He held Les Paul's gaze for a moment without any particular expression. Then he looked back down at the guitar. "Mind if I play it?" he asked. Les Paul shrugged. One shoulder. "Go ahead." Jimmy sat down on a wooden stool near the window. He didn't plug in. There was a small practice amp in the corner, but he didn't reach for it. He just sat with the guitar across his lap and spent about 30 seconds adjusting the tuning. He did it by ear, quickly, with the casual efficiency of someone recalibrating something they already know. The room was still moving around him at first. Conversations continuing, ice settling in glasses. Someone laughing at something near the door. Then Jimmy started playing, and the room changed. It didn't go quiet dramatically. It went quiet the way a room does when something is happening that nobody wants to interrupt by acknowledging it too soon. One conversation stopped, then another, then the laughter near the door dissolved into nothing, and suddenly there were 15 people in a midtown Manhattan studio, all facing the same direction without having decided to. Jimmy was playing completely clean. No effects, no amp, no feedback, no sustain, no theater. Just the natural resonance of a guitar body pressed against a man's ribcage, and it sounded like a full band. His thumb moved along the bassy strings with the steadiness of a clock. His fingers built a melody above it simultaneously, the two lines independent but connected, crossing and separating without ever colliding. He played rhythm and lead at the same time, switching between them so fluidly that for a moment it was genuinely difficult to count the hands involved. He was playing a blues progression, old, the kind of melody that has no author because it belongs to everyone who ever played it and no one in particular, but the way it moved through Jimmy's hands was entirely his own. Les Paul had stopped talking. He was watching Jimmy's left hand, specifically watching it, the way a craftsman examines another craftsman's technique, not with admiration yet, with evaluation, the habit of a man who had spent 50 years understanding how guitars work, what they can and can't do, where the limits are. He noticed the thumb wrapped over the neck, anchoring bass notes in a position most trained players would have avoided or approached differently. He noticed the muting, the way Jimmy's fingers would release string pressure in the fraction of a second between notes, creating tiny pockets of silence that made the notes around them hit harder. It wasn't accidental. It was precise in a way that didn't look like precision. He noticed that the guitar sounded bigger than an unplugged guitar should sound. He noticed that he had stopped evaluating and started listening. These were not the same thing. He knew the difference. He had spent a long time learning the difference. The room had gone quiet enough that you could hear the individual strings. Not the music exactly, the actual physical strings, the vibration of wood under tension, the small sounds of fingers shifting on a fretboard, the guitar breathing against Jimmy's body. A record producer standing a few feet from Les Paul leaned over and said something quietly. Les Paul didn't register what it was. He was somewhere else. He was thinking about the chicken coop in New Jersey. He was thinking about what he'd been trying to do in those years, the clarity he was chasing, the sustain, the way he wanted the instrument to capture sound and hold it without distortion, without accident, without the ugly edges that analog equipment always tried to introduce. He had wanted the guitar to be exact, to be honest, to say only what you told it to say. He was watching Jimi Hendrix play an unplugged Les Paul standard and hearing something that wasn't in the blueprint, something he hadn't designed, hadn't anticipated, hadn't known to look for. He didn't know how to feel about that. He stood very still and kept listening. Jimmy played for about 4 minutes. No announcements, no performance. He didn't look up at the room, didn't acknowledge the attention. He just played until he was done. And when he was done, he let the last note decay completely and rested his palm against the strings. The room held the silence for a moment. Then it released. The applause was quiet. That was the strange part. Not the screaming kind, not the rock concert kind. The kind that happens in a small room when people have witnessed something they're still processing. Hands meeting slowly. A few people shaking their heads without being aware of doing it. Jimmy stood up and set the guitar back where he'd found it, carefully against the wall. Les Paul hadn't moved. He found Jimmy near the door later that evening. Les Paul was not a man who sought people out. He was usually the one being sought. But he crossed the room that night and stood in front of Jimi Hendrix and was quiet for a moment before he said anything. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. Jimmy looked at him. "Records," he said. "Whose?" "All of them," Jimmy said. "Whoever was on the record." Les Paul nodded slowly. He looked at the floor briefly, then back up. "You weren't playing what I expected." "I know," Jimmy said. There was a pause. Someone walked between them, and neither of them moved. "That guitar," Les Paul said. "I built that guitar." Jimmy looked at him steadily. "I know," he said. And then, after a moment, something quiet. Thank you for it. Les Paul didn't answer right away. He nodded once and walked back across the room. He left the gathering earlier than usual that night. He didn't talk about what he'd heard, not in the days after, not in the weeks after. Les Paul was not someone who volunteered stories about being unsettled by someone else. He had a particular kind of pride that didn't accommodate that easily. But in 1991, a journalist from Guitar Player magazine asked him directly about Jimi Hendrix, about what he thought of him, about whether it bothered him, the way Jimmy used the instrument, the feedback, the extremity of it. Les Paul was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he'd spent his whole career trying to control what an electric guitar could do, trying to make it clean and precise and predictable, and that Jimmy had picked up the instrument and found the parts of it that Les Paul had never thought to look for. He said it wasn't what he'd intended. He paused. Then he said that wasn't Jimmy's problem. There's a line musicians reach for when they try to describe Jimi Hendrix. They say he didn't play the guitar. They say he spoke through it. Les Paul spent 50 years understanding guitars better than almost anyone alive. He knew what they were made of, how they worked, where their limits were. He had defined those limits himself in many ways, built them into the instrument. And one evening in November 1967, Jimi Hendrix picked up an unplugged Les Paul standard, sat down on a wooden stool, and showed the man who built it something he hadn't known was in there. That's not theater. That's not noise. That's not a flaw in the signal chain. That's what it sounds like when someone understands a thing more completely than the person who made it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share it with someone who has ever been certain they understood something, until someone else showed them the parts they'd missed.